It was a mild afternoon on November 22nd, 1963. At his Virginia estate, Hickory Hill, Robert F. Bobby Kennedy was enjoying lunch by the pool when the phone rang. On the line was FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover, a man with whom Robert shared mutual distrust. Hoover's voice was cold and emotionless. "I have news for you," he said flatly. "The president's been shot." In that singular moment, Robert's world stopped. President John F. Kennedy, his beloved elder brother Jack, had been struck down by an assassin's bullet in Dallas. Robert clutched a phone as the horrifying words sank in, and his body literally contorted with grief. Shock gave way to anguish. Ethel rushed to him as he slumped by the poolside phone, barely able to speak. "There's so much bitterness," Robert murmured. "I thought they'd get one of us. I thought it would be me." Even in those first moments, his grief carried a grim recognition. The hatred surrounding the Kennedy administration had made violence feel inevitable. He just never imagined it would be John. As news rolled in from Dallas, Robert sprang into action through his haze of sorrow. Even while fearing the worst, he had to know his brother's condition. Soon the devastating confirmation arrived. John F. Kennedy was dead. Robert's next move was pure instinct and love. He headed to Andrews Air Force Base to meet Air Force One, which was carrying home John's body, and the newly sworn-in President Lyndon B. Johnson. When the plane landed in the dark early evening, Robert ignored the trappings of state. He brusquely pushed past Johnson, the new president, without a word, and went straight to Jackie Kennedy, who emerged in shock, still wearing her blood-stained pink suit. At that moment, Robert had one concern: to comfort his brother's widow and ensure his fallen brother was treated with dignity. Eyewitnesses noted Robert's face was ashen, his eyes rimmed red, yet he maintained a stoic composure during these public moments. Inside, however, he was shattering. That night at the White House, the full weight of the loss descended on Robert. With the formalities over and the crowds gone, Robert's composure finally broke. A family friend heard sobbing echoing from Robert's room. The president's strong, stoic brother was now a grieving sibling asking unanswerable questions into the void. "Why? Why, God? Why?" Robert cried over and over in despair. In a single day, Robert F. Kennedy's life had been upended. The brother he adored and had served was gone, taken by an assassin's bullets. And though the Kennedy family was no stranger to tragedy, this loss was unlike any before. The shock and sorrow of that day would alter the course of Robert's life forever. Aftermath, grief, guilt, and a new path. In the weeks following John F. Kennedy's assassination, Robert Kennedy was a shell of himself. Friends and aides who saw the normally energetic Attorney General in December 1963 barely recognized him. He moved through life in a veil of grief, a shattered man both emotionally and physically. It was a physical blow to him, that loss of his brother, recalled close friend John Siegenthaler, noting that Robert seemed actually in pain from heartbreak. Kennedy was haunted by survivor's guilt, the agonizing question of why fate had spared him, but not John. He had always been the fiercest fighter in the family, the one with the hard-edged, ruthless reputation, yet he was alive, and the brother he idolized was dead. Over and over, Robert voiced a cruel thought. Perhaps it should have been him instead. For Robert, the assassination of his brother was not only a devastating personal loss, but an identity crisis. For more than a decade, Robert's entire career and purpose had been bound up with John's. He had managed John's political campaigns, served as his closest advisor, then as Attorney General carrying out John's agenda. Now, suddenly, that orbit was gone. In public, Robert tried to carry on John's legacy, quoting his late brother in speeches, even wearing John's old worn-out tweed coat for comfort. But privately, he was unmoored. Who was he, and what would he do with his life? Biographer Jack Newfield later wrote of Robert's tortured soul-searching. The once fierce and focused Attorney General now wandered through his days in a fog of mourning, often retreating into literature for solace. He read the Greek poets on tragedy and fate, memorizing verses by Aeschylus about pain and wisdom, trying to make sense of a world where pain that cannot forget falls drop by drop upon the heart. Meanwhile, the political world had not stopped turning. Lyndon B. Johnson was now president, a development that added a bitter wrinkle to Robert's grief. The Kennedys and Johnson had long been rivals. Robert in particular had clashed frequently with LBJ and harbored a deep mistrust of him. Now RFK faced the galling reality that the man neither he nor John fully trusted was sitting in John's chair. In private, Robert saw Johnson as a usurper of Camelot. He and LBJ maintained a strained courtesy in public. Johnson even asked Robert to remain as Attorney General to lend continuity. And for a time, Robert acquiesced, determined to enshrine his brother's legacy however he could. But the relationship was icy. Johnson pointedly kept Robert at arm's length on many decisions, and Robert for his part felt politically sidelined in an administration led by a man he could barely hide his contempt for. When rumors swirled that Johnson might consider Robert for vice president on the 1964 ticket, LBJ adamantly refused, and even mocked Robert's eagerness, deepening the humiliation. By mid-1964, it was clear to Robert that his position in Johnson's Washington was untenable. Still drowning in grief, he looked for a path forward that was his alone. In August 1964, Robert took the leap to leave Johnson's cabinet and run for the U.S. Senate for New York, seeking a new platform from which to continue John Kennedy's work. He won that Senate seat and over the next few years began to reforge his identity. The tragedy had softened Robert in visible ways. He became more attuned to issues of poverty, civil rights and social justice, often citing his own family's suffering to empathize with others in pain. Yet one private mission continued to burn quietly inside Robert F. Kennedy, finding out who was truly responsible for John's murder. As he picked up the pieces of his career, Robert also began a discreet search for the truth about Dallas. Quiet investigations and lingering questions. In the immediate aftermath of the assassination, even amid his mourning, Robert Kennedy's instincts as the nation's top law enforcement officer kicked in. Something about the situation in Dallas didn't sit right with him. That very night of November 22, 1963, Robert started asking questions. Still in shock and near catatonic with depression, he nevertheless picked up the phone and called one of the Justice Department's organized crime experts in Chicago. His instruction was pointed. Find out if the mafia had anything to do with this. This was no random hunch. Robert Kennedy knew that he and President Kennedy had accumulated dangerous enemies, and none were more dangerous in Robert's mind than the mobsters he himself had been zealously prosecuting as Attorney General. As dawn broke on a grief-stricken Washington, Robert Kennedy already suspected that his brother's assassination might not have been the work of a lone drifter, but rather the bloody handiwork of conspirators. And if conspirators existed, Robert believed if anyone was involved, it was organized crime. Over the following months and years, Robert Kennedy quietly conducted his own fact-finding, separate from the official Warren Commission investigation ordered by President Johnson. Publicly, Robert maintained a studiously neutral face about the Warren Commission's report. When reporters asked him if he accepted the official finding that a lone gunman, Lee Harvey Oswald, had killed President Kennedy, Robert said he supported the Commission's conclusions. He even signed a statement endorsing the final Warren report in 1964, and coolly told the press he had no intention of reading the lengthy report himself. This deference was in part a matter of duty. Robert did not want to ignite a public constitutional crisis or appear vengeful, and in part born of political calculation as he planned his own future. Behind closed doors, however, Robert never truly believed the lone gunman story. For years, the public was led to believe that RFK accepted the Warren report's conclusion that Oswald acted alone. That belief is a myth. In private, Robert F. Kennedy was dismissive of the Commission's work, viewing its investigation as inadequate, even shoddy, and its conclusions rushed. According to his son, Robert Kennedy Jr., Robert only publicly supported the Warren report, but privately he was dismissive of it. The Attorney General turned senator simply did not buy that the charismatic president who made so many bitter enemies could be taken out by one angry misfit acting alone. Robert's private investigation, though necessarily limited, he was no longer in charge of the FBI after 1964, turned up disturbing clues that pointed away from the official story. Working through trusted contacts in the Justice Department and FBI, RFK examined Lee Harvey Oswald's background and connections, and Jack Ruby's as well. Ruby was the Dallas nightclub owner who, in a shocking twist, had murdered Oswald 2 days after JFK's assassination, silencing the alleged assassin before he could ever testify. Why had Ruby, a man with known ties to organized crime figures, done this? In 1964, Robert Kennedy obtained Jack Ruby's phone records from the weeks leading up to November 22, 1963. What he saw made his blood run cold. Ruby's list of contacts read like a who's who of the underworld. In fact, as Robert examined the long list of phone calls, he realized the list was almost a duplicate of the people I called before the Rackets Committee. Years earlier, as a Senate investigator and Attorney General, Robert had pursued major mafia bosses and corrupt union leaders on the McClellan Rackets Committee, and now many of those same names showed up in Jack Ruby's call logs. It was a striking piece of evidence suggesting that Ruby was in touch with the very mobsters the Kennedys had been targeting. As Robert Jr. later summarized, those phone records were like an inventory of mafia leaders under government investigation. To Robert, this was no coincidence. It hinted at a chilling nexus between Oswald's killer and the crime syndicates that had motive to retaliate against the Kennedy brothers. Robert Kennedy dug further. He quietly tasked investigators to research Oswald's associations and any ties between Oswald and known anti-Kennedy actors. He learned that Oswald, far from being an unknown drifter, had a strange and twisting history, including a defection to the Soviet Union and open support for Fidel Castro's Cuba, as well as murky contacts in the anti-Castro exile community. Could one of the Kennedy administration's international enemies have used Oswald as a pawn? Robert considered it. Indeed, in those tense early days, many feared a foreign plot. The CIA's multiple attempts on Castro's life were secret at the time, but RFK was aware of them, and he knew if Cuba or the Soviets were involved, it could even mean war. But as more facts emerged, Robert's attention kept returning to domestic adversaries, especially the mafia. He knew how the mob worked. He knew that gangsters had both the motive and the means to orchestrate a hit, and to find a fall guy like Oswald to take the blame. In fact, as early as 1962, one mob boss had explicitly threatened the Kennedys in a way that now seemed eerily prophetic. According to a later investigation, New Orleans Mafia Don Carlos Marcello, whom Robert had aggressively deported in 1961, told an associate that one doesn't kill a dog by cutting off the tail, meaning Robert, the Attorney General. If you want to kill a dog, you don't cut off the tail, you cut off the head, Marcello sneered. In Marcello's Sicilian slang, he vowed to take the stone out of my shoe regarding the Kennedys, an ominous hint at removing President Kennedy to neutralize Robert's war on organized crime. After Dallas, he had not forgotten Marcello's threat. Who did Robert F. Kennedy believe was responsible? All evidence indicates that Robert F. Kennedy became convinced his brother was killed as part of a conspiracy, and that at the heart of that conspiracy were the national crime syndicates. He told at least one close friend outright that the mafia was principally responsible for John's death. To his aide and speechwriter Richard Goodwin, Robert confided that if anyone conspired to kill the president, it was organized crime above all. And in conversations with family friend and historian Arthur Schlesinger Jr., Robert pointed the finger even more specifically. He spoke of that guy in New Orleans being behind the assassination, a clear reference to Carlos Marcello, the Louisiana mafia boss. This theory made sense to Robert. Marcello and other mob leaders, such as Chicago's Sam Giancana and Tampa's Santos Traficante, had felt betrayed by the Kennedys. They allegedly helped JFK's election in 1960 through union connections and illicit funds, expecting leniency, only to be aggressively pursued by Attorney General Robert Kennedy's organized crime crackdown. In 1963, their resentment was at a boiling point. By killing President Kennedy, the mob could both satisfy a vendetta and effectively halt Robert's crusade against them. The pieces fit. Motive, revenge and self-preservation. Means, hitmen and underworld networks. And opportunity, Kennedy's open motorcade in Dallas. As one of Robert's Justice Department colleagues later reflected, there is a haunting credibility to the theory that our organized crime drive prompted a plan to strike back at the Kennedy brothers. What about other suspects? Over the years, many conspiracy theories have swirled around JFK's assassination, implicating everyone from the CIA and anti-Castro Cuban exiles to the Soviet KGB, the military-industrial complex, and even Kennedy's own vice president. Robert Kennedy was certainly aware of these swirling theories, and he did not rule out the possibility that multiple forces might have been involved. For example, some researchers note that the CIA had tangled involvements with both the Cuban exiles and the mafia. The agency had even enlisted mobsters in plots to kill Castro, blurring the lines between foreign and domestic enemies. Robert knew better than most how many powerful groups might have wanted John F. Kennedy dead. After all, he had been at his brother's side during the Bay of Pigs fiasco, the Cuban Missile Crisis, and fights with right-wing extremists at home. Privately, he weighed the possibilities of Cuban or Soviet involvement in Dallas, but ultimately he saw no clear evidence of a foreign mastermind. The trail kept leading back to the homegrown hatred that had surrounded the Kennedy administration. One glaring suspect in the public's mind was Lyndon B. Johnson. Did Robert Kennedy think LBJ had a hand in killing John to claim the presidency for himself? The relationship between Robert and Johnson was toxic, and it's easy to imagine Robert's suspicion. But the historical record provides no indication that Robert Kennedy ever accused Lyndon Johnson of orchestrating his brother's murder. While conspiracy theorists later did put Johnson at the center of plots, citing, for instance, a dubious deathbed confession by CIA operative E. Howard Hunt, alleging LBJ ordered the hit, Robert himself never voiced such a theory. He certainly resented Johnson for political reasons and distrusted him immensely, referring to him as an interloper in Camelot. But when it came to culpability for the assassination, Robert's focus stayed elsewhere. If anything, Robert likely viewed Johnson as someone who benefited from the assassination, an uncomfortable fact he could not change, rather than as its architect. In the years after 1963, Robert and Lyndon maintained a wary détente in public, but behind closed doors their feud simmered. Still, even as RFK privately probed conspiracy leads, he did not aim them at the Oval Office. Instead, Robert F. Kennedy's certainty solidified around the idea of a mafia plot. He had ample reason to think so. Beyond his own investigative findings, the Ruby phone records, Marcello's threats, Oswald's murky ties, there was later even an FBI informant's report that Carlos Marcello bragged about having JFK killed. In one account, Marcello in the 1980s allegedly confessed in prison, saying, "Yeah, I had the little son of a killed." Though Marcello conveniently claimed he was just sorry he couldn't do it himself. True or not, that kind of boast only reinforced what Robert already suspected. And there was Jack Ruby's own behavior. Ruby claimed he acted out of grief and patriotism in shooting Oswald, but Robert knew Ruby's underworld background. It looked more likely to Robert that Ruby silenced Oswald to protect mob secrets, not as a spontaneous act of loyalty. In short, Robert Kennedy did not buy the simple lone gunman narrative at all. As his son would later put it, the evidence at this point, I think, is very, very convincing that it was not a lone gunman. Robert Kennedy's private position aligns with that assessment. He was fairly convinced that others were involved in killing his brother, and those others, he believed, were chiefly in the networks of organized crime. Throughout the remaining 4.5 years of his life, Robert F. Kennedy kept these beliefs largely to himself. He neither had the power nor the platform to officially challenge the Warren Commission's findings, at least not yet. Friends later revealed that Robert felt handcuffed by circumstance. He publicly supported the Warren Commission report, but privately was dismissive of it. He likely calculated that raising a public alarm about a conspiracy could tear the country apart or be written off as a grieving brother's obsession. Instead, Robert chose to bide his time. Many who knew him have suggested that had Robert Kennedy won the presidency in 1968, he intended to reopen the investigation into John F. Kennedy's assassination and finally expose the truth. Tragically, he never got that chance. In June 1968, while celebrating a hard-fought victory in the California presidential primary, Robert Kennedy was assassinated by a gunman in Los Angeles. The nation was stunned by a second Kennedy murder in less than 5 years. To this day, debate rages over whether Robert's killing was another lone wolf attack or part of a darker scheme. Chillingly, even that event had a mafia footnote. His assassin, Sir Han, had briefly worked at a horse track run by an associate of Carlos Marcello. The cruel coincidence of both Kennedy brothers falling to assassins only cemented in many minds the sense of a broad conspiracy against the Kennedy family. Do you want to bring bad things with you wherever you go? Our episodes are now available as a podcast. Look us up on your favorite podcast app and listen to the most truth-seeking true crime podcast out there.